So, hi and welcome back to Next Level Sim Gaming, and I want to say a huge thank you, first of all, to the supporters and subscribers of the channel. There are some exciting new sponsors on board, and none of this would be possible without you. And if you haven't already, don't forget to join the club. So, in this episode, we'll be looking if it's finally time to unsync those cores, following on from the final 0x12b microcode update revision. Now, I've been running with the settings shown in the previous videos for about 6 months now, and certainly no complaints in terms of either temperature, stability, or performance. And the use case for me is everything from demanding VR games, sim racing, and of course, 4K rendering and productivity. Now, one thing I had observed was that stability has improved tremendously since the update, which made me explore the possibility of enabling boost again. But of course, with boost also comes high temperatures. In this video, we'll be using the Asus overclock settings and not the Intel default settings, which of course are still no better, but we will be observing the Intel power limits, and this is not an overclocking video, but a continuation in helping you achieve the best stability and temperatures in your games. And so on that note, let's get straight to the video and see which is better for your PC. So this video is a continuation of the undervolting and tuning guides, and in this section we're going to be looking at setting the BIOS first. So into the BIOS on the Z790 motherboard. And if you've been using the settings from the previous videos, I'm going to show you how you create a custom profile so that you don't have to set them all in again. So the first thing we are going to do is we're going to go into the tool section, and we are going to go to the Asus user profile. We're going to create a name. So in this instance, we're going to call it 55 sync all, and then we're going to click on the save to profile. In this instance, it's number 1 because all the profiles are empty. Simply click on the number 1 once you've entered the name and press enter. It'll then prompt you to save to profile. And then we are simply clicking yes. You'll see that the 55 sync all has appeared at the top, and then we are then selecting exit, and we simply select save changes and reset. We then are resetting our setting back to the factory defaults. You'll see that the 55 sync all is then saved. In AI Tweaker, we then need to select the Asus Advanced Overclock profile. We are then setting our RAM to our desired speed, and into the AI Tweaker DGVRM, we are selecting level 4 recommended for overclock for the load line calibration. Back into the main menu again, and we're then going to scroll down, and we're going to go to the internal CPU power management, and we're going to manually change and enforce the limits. So the first thing we're going to do is going to manually type in the CPU core cache limit, and we're going to change that to 400, and we're going to change the long duration and short duration power limits to 253. We need to also make sure that we disable unlimited ICC max, and then we need to then move on to IACEP, click enable, and SACP, which is the current excursion protection, enable both. Moving down in the DGVRM, we then select the adaptive mode and the offset, which is a minus, and we're setting a 0.050 undervolt. And then moving on, just for quickly setting the CPU fan configuration. This is when we disable the actual system fans in the Corsair software for when we're benchmarking, just to ensure obviously we've got sufficient cooling. We're manually then searching Intel virtualization, and we are disabling this, as you'll see here. And then we then also need to type only undervolt protection, and we need to ensure that that's disabled. In this instance, it's disabled by default. Now, the reason for these two changes to ensure we can launch Intel XTU, which we're going to be using today, to perform the undervolt in a software state, and then at the end of that, we can then set it manually in a hard state in the actual BIOS. If you want to see all those steps in more detail, then you can refer to the previous video in the series. So part 2, and we're onto the Asus Overclock profile. So we've set the profile. This is a profile out of the box from the Asus Overclock settings. The only thing we've done is we've enforced the limits in the hard sense. So we have set the Intel Extreme profile power settings, which is 400 amps and 253 and 253 short and long term power duration. Now, as usual, we're on to TimeSpy, and this is an accelerated version of TimeSpy. Going to be using 2 benchmarks today. First one being TimeSpy, and the second one being the usual Cinebench R23. So So we are looking for a score on CPU, ideally of above 26 to make it an excellent score. So first thing we see is that the boost hasn't kicked in, but the core frequency is up to 57. So the CPU state at the moment is back to the Asus overclock settings, and this means that we have all cores running at 57 apart from the two performance cores, which are both running at the 6000 megahertz. So now on to Intel XTU. So this is Intel XTU. If you're not familiar with it, refers to previous videos where we've gone into a bit more detail. Once again, you need to disable Undervolt protection and you need to disable the Intel virtualization to make this run. So all the settings we just set in BIOS are replicated in here. So we're just going to have a quick scan through them, as you can see. And the only setting that we would normally change in here would potentially be the Intel overclocking firmware velocity boost. Now, the way that this works is under the correct conditions, the velocity boost will allow the cores to boost up to the 6 GHz on the performance cores. So you can see here we've got the 60 multiplied cores on 1 and 2, and if we scroll down further, as we will in a moment, you'll see that the performance cores are highlighted by an asterisk, and that will be different potentially for your processor. That's dictated by silicon quality and a number of other factors. So you can see cores 4 and 5 on my CPU are the performance cores, and those are the preferred cores. So just scanning through, just to familiarize yourself with the rest of the process, you'll see that the undervolt in here is at 0.05 as we set in the BIOS. You'll see that there is a thermal velocity boost offset, so essentially that means that when it reaches 80 degrees it will knock the core clock down by -1, and the same when it reaches 90 it will also reduce the multiplier by 2. Moving back up just to check all the settings over, which is a good idea to do when you're making changes because it can make some erroneous changes sometimes. So we've set the 400 amps, we've set the 253 on both the short and long term duration. I'm not going to touch the E-cores on this occasion, and we can see that the timings are set on XMP tweaked, which is what we set into the BIOS. Once we're happy with everything, then we need to review any changes and we can then move on to the next step. However, what we are going to do just at this stage, just going to apply a slight undervolt to make an increment once we've benchmarked this particular setting. So I'm going to add another 0.05 in there, and we're then going to move on to the hardware monitor. So hardware monitor shows that the current idle temperatures are performing fine, and we can see that the multipliers are okay and that there's no erroneous changes or anything that we should be aware of in here. There was an issue with the BlueStacks and the Corsair software, but it was recently rectified in the latest NVIDIA updates, and I did put a link to that information on the channel, and thanks to Amir, the channel contributor, for pointing out to me at an early stage. So we're going to move on to a stress test, and this is the Advanced Vector Extensions 2 stress test on the Intel XTU application. In case you're wondering what the AVX2 test is, so the AVX2 is a heightened CPU state which puts the processor under much more strain and performance. So starting a stress test off, and you can see that the first thing that flashes up is that we are power throttled, and also the current throttling is the limits that we imposed on the CPU in the previous state. So 253 and 253 on long and short term power duration. So essentially every time a processor is trying to boost, it's being throttled and reduced back. So essentially you probably won't see any significant boosting throughout the course of the actual benchmark. Now, if we were to run the processor on the Asus overclock profile without actually setting any power limits, then essentially it would run untethered and we'd have firmer throttling, and we'd also have other issues that would occur. However, you can see on this instance the AVX2 test has passed, which is fantastic. So moving back onto part 3 now, which is the same test applied. We're going to add minus 0.010 multiplier onto the equation this time. We're going to add an extra 0.10 into there. Simply moving down onto the core voltage offset, which you see here, and we're going to add another 0.010 in there. I would normally reduce them in multipliers of 0.005. However, on this occasion, I know what my processor is capable of and what it can do. Remember, this will be down to a number of factors. It may not work particularly well for you, and essentially, as you've probably seen from previous videos, it's all about trial and error, and it is time consuming, and it sometimes can be quite frustrating. So looking at the cores here, you can see that the performance cores are at 6000 megahertz and the rest of the cores are at 5700, and you can see that the E-cores remain the same. So we're just having that quick quality check, so just moving through everything just to make sure that nothing has changed, because I've known on occasion to have changed between profile changes. Now, on the subject of what would happen if we were to apply the Asus overclock profile with no power limits attached, now the issue that occurred previously was that the Asus overclock profile and other motherboard manufacturers' profiles were allowing the processors to run at untethered limits. Now, there's two elements to that. There's a microcode fix, which is essentially locked the vid requests down to a safe level, so the processor isn't requesting too much power in itself. However, if we were to allow the processor to run at untethered limits on the Intel parameters that we've set, then essentially the CPU would be hitting firmware throttle repeatedly and obviously potentially could be damaging for the processor. So we're now into, once again, another stress test, and you can see this is an accelerated stress test once again. So you can see there's a number of current throttles during the course of that test, and those current throttles relate to the 253 and 253 long and short term power durations. Now the processor is obviously reaching a point where it's trying to boost. Every time it tries to boost, it's reaching a current throttle because it's simply not able to pass that. Now the stress test has passed on that basis on the Undervolt, which is slightly higher, and now we're moving on to Cinebench R23. Now, there are a number of other Cinebench tests out there, and people have commented, why don't you use Cinebench R15, for example, or Cinebench 2024? Cinebench R23 is a pretty fast test, and it's a very power hungry test, so if you are going to have problems, you'll find that this potentially won't run or it will show problems very quickly. So as you can see, we're not getting any real gains in terms of performance over the previous profiles that we've created. So what we're now going to do is we're going to look at actually reducing the core levels to what we've set previously, and we're also going to add some performance increments on the actual performance cores. So we're going to now reduce the ratios, and we're going to actually set all cores to 55 with the exception of the two performance cores, which we're going to set to 59. And the reason for this is because obviously we're hitting some current throttle quite persistently, and we're going to allow a little bit of headroom into the process to enable it to boost. We're going to let it boost up to 5900 megahertz because 6000 megahertz and between 5900 is there's very little difference. So the higher the frequencies, the higher the temperatures. So what we're now going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to adjust the ratios. So reducing the two performance core ratios down to 59 and the active core ratios down to 55. And you can see the two top active cores, which are performance cores there. We're going to keep the TVB limits or reduction in place should they obviously reach that temperature to enable safe play. Now, running the stress test again, and once again it's an accelerated stress test, but we can see that the temperatures have come right down, so we're now straight away below 70 degrees and it's staying around 70 degrees for some time. Obviously as the test progresses, this is 100% CPU utilization, and obviously of course the temperatures will increase, but you'll see that the actual current throttling will probably reduce or probably non-existent. So as you can see here, coming towards the end of the test, and previously I think we had 4 CPU current throttles. On this occasion it appears we have none. So the temperatures are dramatically reduced. We actually didn't exceed 80 degrees on that occasion, so there's been no CPU current throttles, which is exactly what we're looking for, and we've passed the AVX2 stress test with ease. Back onto Cinebench R23 once again, and we're running one pass again on this, and once again we haven't reduced the actual undervolt level. We're still on the 0.65. What we're now going to do is going to run one pass on Cinebench R23. We're going to look at the score, and then we are then going to make further adjustments. So again, you can see that the score is likely to have increased. So the score has increased slightly, but we're looking for that magical 40,000. You're not going to see the magical 40,000 today, by the way, because bearing in mind that all background applications should be closed when benchmarking. Unfortunately, I'm having to run screen capture card software to actually capture some of this footage. Now again, with regards to undervolting, I would recommend dialing out at least 0.05 at a time. Bearing in mind on these demonstrations, I'm doubling that only on the basis that I know what CPU is capable of. But again, it's quite a frustrating process, and once again, we haven't achieved this CPU score we're looking for. We're still around 25, just under 25,500 there. And in terms of real-time monitoring, as you can see, the curve is flat. The CPU isn't boosting due to the fact it's essentially just not able to pull enough power to do so. So you can see the clock frequencies there at 5900 megahertz, and you can see that the average temperature through the test was very good, 69 degrees, and you can see the actual GPU temperature just there as well. And you can look at the actual outcome of these tests in the video description. I've actually put the links in there so you can look at them in a bit more detail. So this time around, we're going to dial out another 0.010, and we're now down to 0.075. So once again, sense checking everything to make sure that nothing has changed and that nothing has jumped out of line. I did had on occasion did some sessions on Intel XTU, and it kept upping the actual power limit for some weird reason. Now this was on a previous version of Intel XTU. Thankfully, it hasn't happened on this new version, but once again, I would definitely recommend if you are using XTU, just check for everything and just make sure everything is fine before you click apply, and then you actually run the stress test. So as you can see on his occasion, everything remains the same. Once we're happy with everything, we can then simply move on to the stress test again with AVX2. Now, once you're happy with everything and you found the right undervolt for yourself, I would recommend probably running AVX2 tests for at least 30 minutes. And the reason being is obviously because that way we can be sure we've obviously reached the right levels of temperature and right levels of performance. Now, if it's going to fail, it will fail probably within 1 or 2 minutes. So 5 minutes is sufficient just for the sake of benchmarking and finding the right undervolt. I have found when I've been using it in the past, when it does fail, sometimes it will reboot the machine, so don't be alarmed about that. If you do find it does that, it will simply reboot and load into a previous state, and it will reset everything back to the default. So as you can see here, we've completed the stress test again, and I know personally that my processor is capable of up to probably 0.09, so everything in that respect was fine. Now we're running another pass on Cinebench R23, and this occasion you can see that we are running the 55 all core and up to 59 on the performance cores. So we're looking for a score hopefully of around the 39,000 mark. So we got a score of 38,081, which is probably at the lower end of the scale. So with the OBS software running in the background and the other applications that I'm having to run to capture this, without that, it would achieve around 41,000 or just over 40,000 and a half perhaps. So what we're looking for is looking to gain a bit of performance back now, and once again, I'm not going to undervolt it any further, because essentially we're going to get to that level where we were on the fine line with potentially starving the processor, especially under intensive games such as Unreal Engine games and games that rely on obviously heavy processing and CPU dependent process. And in my instance, when I'm using DaVinci Resolve and some other software, whereas rendering is concerned, I don't want it crashing in the middle of rendering a video. So we've got a great score on TimeSpy, and it's 25,240, which is actually slightly worse than it was previously. We've got a CPU test on FPS of 84, and you can see that the curves are looking okay. There's a significant drop off there, which is where obviously the tests are handing over from one to the other, but it's not really where we want it to be. So is it worth utilizing the Intel Adaptive Boost technology? Now, I'm going to put a summary against each of the end marks in the benchmarkings towards the end of this video. So now this is just going into a bit more detail, and you can see the temperatures are good, 69 degrees, which we would expect for such a level of undervolt. Undervolt is driving the process to be more efficient. You can see that the cores are boosted okay, running at 5900 megahertz. But what we're going to do, we're going to, as an experiment, go back into the BIOS. We're going to reload that profile. We're now going to benchmark utilizing that profile. So I've already done this, and I've been into BIOS, and I'm now back into Intel XTU. I've reloaded the profile we saved at the beginning of the video, and to make it fair in terms of the last test, I'm now going to add an extra 0.010 undervolt onto the 0.065 that I was running previously on that profile. So if we knock that 0.075, and then we're going to run a stress test just to make sure it's going to be okay. Obviously, as I mentioned, I've run plenty of stress tests on the processor, and I've managed up to 0.090 with no issues. So we are now running a stress test, once again vastly accelerated in terms of what it normally would be for the sake of the reduction of time of a video. And you can see we've had a couple of power throttles during the course of that. So the reason for that is that we have all cores operating at the same frequency. But the stress test passed, the undervolt is fine, and now we're going to run Cinebench R23, and we are going to see what the outcome would be on this 55 all cores. Now, I would say that based on previous outcomes, it will be around 39,000, and this is based purely on the fact that running the OBS software in the background to capture this video just here. So the outcome of which is not a bad estimate, so it's 39,120, as we would expect. Now, the purpose of the video really was to demonstrate that, yes, we have a turbo boost available, and it's a little bit like having a turbo in your vehicle to reach X amount of horsepower. You're not going to drive around with your foot on the throttle to achieve turbo when you're driving 100% of the time. In the same way, essentially, the turbo function was essentially more of a marketing gimmick, I feel, than anything else. Now, overclockers can utilize it if you've got sufficient cooling, but for 99% of the games you play and for 99% of the experience you'll have on your PC, it's really not required. So, onto the final CPU test, and the outcome is finally an excellent score, which is 35102, and finally, we've achieved an excellent CPU score of over 26,000. And you can see here that the FPS have increased on the CPU alone of just over 5, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in percentage terms it's enough. And you can see that the curve on the cores is completely flat, which obviously flatter the curves, the more consistency and stability you have. Now, as always, the final part of the video, we're just going to look at the actual PC specifications. If your PC specifications are different, remember your results will vary. And remember, this video is based on the specifications you can see here. So, thank you once again for watching. And there are some links here to some other videos, which I'm sure you will find of help. And if this video has helped you, it would be hugely appreciated if you would like, subscribe and share. And until next time, take care and I'll see you again in the next video.